Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Reverend Dr. Christopher Benek. Chris is a follower of Jesus Christ, a pastor, husband, and father. He's also a global emerging tech and theology expert who is internationally known for his social and religious analysis and commentary. He is widely recognized as a techno-theologian, futurist, ethicist, Christian transhumanist, public speaker, writer, and tech pastor. He's the leading clergy expert regarding artificial intelligence in the world. So let's welcome Chris to the show. Chris, what else would you like our listeners to know about you?
I'm a pastor in Miami, Florida. I'm a pastor at First Miami Presbyterian Church here, and I also am the pastor and CEO of Co-Creators, which is our motto is better people, better tech, better world, and it's a organization that deals with the intersection of faith and technology, and we have a bunch of initiatives that are coming out of that, and I think we'll talk about some of those coming up. So,
awesome. Tell us about your journey of faith, what it's looked like, how you came to Christ, and what that looks like today.
Sure. So I didn't grow up in the church at all, really. I went to funerals and weddings. That was about my most interaction. I became a Christian late in college, actually, and I went to a church that I went with a girl, probably with no good intentions, and she drugged me there. And long story short, it didn't work out with the girl, but it worked out with the church. And then I was in an honors program, and I grew up in kind of meager settings, and I was going to school to be a lawyer because lawyers made money, and I thought that's the way I'd get out of where I was living in Northeast Ohio, and because there just wasn't a lot of economic opportunity there, and so I went and talked to these folks who were assigned to me as mentors, and they happened to both be theologians who focused on ethics, which I didn't even know what a theologian was at the time. And they sat me down and they said, Chris, tell me about you. And I did. And they said, Chris, you don't want to be a lawyer. You want to be a pastor. You just don't know it yet. You need to go to seminary. And I didn't even know there were Protestant seminaries, so this is telling you how raw I was. My response was, "Well, I don't want to be celibate," and and they had a nice laugh about that. And so they said, "Hey, we want you to look at a couple schools." And what I found out was one of those people was a guy named Gil Meilander, who's a professor at Valparaiso. And he was on George Bush Sr.'s Bioethic Advisory Commission. And he had been a student of a guy named Max Stackhouse, who was a professor. Max is now deceased, but was a professor at Princeton. And I went to Princeton Seminary, and Max sat me down and said, "Tell me about yourself." And I did. And the only thing he said was, "You sound like a Princeton man to me. I'll see you next fall." And sure enough, the following summer, I was there for Intro Greek. And so now, I didn't know anything when I went to Princeton Seminary. My roommate was like fifth generation Princeton pastor. And, I had read one or two books of the Bible. I remember my first Old Testament class, the professor made a joke about Abraham and Isaac, and everyone laughed, and I didn't even know who they were. And so it was a pretty steep, I was on my knees praying for all sorts of things that first year. And it was a pretty steep learning curve, but I did really well in ethics. I ended up winning the prize for Religion Society there by my senior year, and I did an additional year. And so I came out, and in the midst of that, I had I had been baptized in a Church of Christ. They said you could go back to Bible school. I had, if you want to become a pastor, and I had worked like 70 hours a week on top of going to school because I just didn't have any money. And I was pretty sure God didn't want me to do that again. And if you get into Princeton, they pay your tuition, and that seemed like a far better road. And but I really went through a discernment process, and by the end of it, I felt called to be part of the PCUSA, which is where I'm in. I was not ready to be ordained when I was finished with my second master's there, but I went into a church, and I went back to rural Ohio, a place I never thought I'd be. I was there for 7 years, and I kind of checked the boxes I needed to check. I was teaching some college philosophy and ethics classes kind of on the side. I became the associate pastor of that church, built great ministry there. I received a call to a church in Hilton Head, South Carolina, where I served as an associate, but kind of like almost like an executive pastor for a while there. I then came to, that was a tough call. I then came to Fort Lauderdale, kind of trying to be like the third string pastor, and a bunch of things happened, and I ended up being the person leading them through a transitional time. And then while I was there, I did a doctorate of ministry that focused on theology and science, and that's kind of where I got into this emerging tech space. And I had somebody from Gizmodo call and ask me about artificial intelligence, and they said, what do I think about AI and faith? And I said something to the effect of, I don't think that Christ's redemptive purposes are necessarily limited to human beings. And I thought that was a very straightforward statement because, it talks about the rocks crying out and all of creation, right? But that article got highlighted in Gizmodo, and the very next day I was on the front of the tech page with Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Stephen Hawking on the Daily Mail's tech page with a picture of me, and it just kind of blew up after that. And so I did a big press blitz, and what was interesting about all that was that this is where the idea for co-creators came about, because people started seeing there is this guy talking about artificial, and this is years and years ago now, but there was a person talking about emerging tech and faith, and they just had not heard of that. And so people were calling me kind of with really weird requests. Like they would say, I'm in virtual reality, or I'm in genetic engineering, and my mom is a devout Catholic. What do you think, if she was still on earth, what do you think she'd think of this? And they're asking these questions of ultimate meaning, and I realized, wow, there's a real ministry here. And then I got people who were calling and saying, I have an entrepreneurial idea that's in technology, but I don't know that the church has thought about these things. Can you help me to think through these things? And so when I finished up at First Fort Lauderdale, I got some startup funding, and I started Co-Creators. And I was doing that, and I was speaking all over the world and advising politicians and doing all sorts of stuff. And then I received a call to come here to First Miami, and I've been serving here for a couple years and doing co-creators with that, and so just have a whole plethora of things going on. But that's kind of been my walk. It's kind of, God has always kind of grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and said, "Hey, keep up," and so I'm just running to try to keep up with what God's doing. So.
I love it. I'm a hustler too, who likes to do too much. And I
think that's a great thing, though. I mean, I think that's where creativity comes out of. I think people undervalue juggling a lot of things. In tech, they say fail fast, right? In the church, our motto tends to be fail really, really painfully slowly. Yeah, right. So instead, I've tried to bring that tech piece in and say, how do we just identify where we're called and make educated, intentional moves to towards success, but not get stuck either, that we got to ride that thing all the way to the bottom if it's not working, right? So.
Boy, we could spend another 40 minutes talking about that. Let's tell our listeners real quick, spiritual practices that you've developed or might recommend to others.
These are kind of simple things, but there's a group called Adventures in Mission that's they do mission trips all over. They were the largest short-term mission group. They're not a mainline group. They're like a non-denominational group or something. But they really focus on listening prayer. And for me, that's been something that's been really important to me is I find so much when we pray, we are always asking and we're not listening. And so for me, creating times and spaces where I am intentional about that. So I walk every day. I've made it kind of a commitment that I walk 10,000 steps a day. So I go out and that takes me more than an hour to do. But I use that time as kind of a reflective and a meditative time to do that. And so kind of then developing that to where you're not just listening during that time, but where you're trying to be intentional about hearing God in whatever situation you're in, and then being present in that, being present in the moment with what God may be doing. And so that's an intentional practice. It's not like you're not going to necessarily read a bunch of books about that, but it's something I've learned over time how to, I think, cultivate that in my own life. And then, just regularly engaging in the scriptures and prayer, and then the, kind of the things that are pastors have the privilege of being involved with and being part of the church because you're in fellowship and community and those kind of things. And even though we're in kind of a different role where we don't experience those the same way as other people do, I still get a lot of joy in that. And for me, kind of the creative process of technology is a spiritual practice for me. And what I mean by that is I think, we always talk about the Trinitarian formula of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but I like to think about how are we made in the image of a creator God, and a God that created the cosmos, and what does it mean for us to walk in the creative ways of a God in that way? And I think that's an important. We don't talk about. We stick to our old verbiage, and it kind of limits our. What's it mean to model after a redeemer God? What's it mean to walk in the ways, or not even walk so much, but follow in the ways of a spirit God in a digital age, right? I think these are like big things that we need to think about, And so those have kind of been some of my basics.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Let me take a break here real quick to pay the bills, and we'll come back. Okay, we're back with Reverend Dr. Chris Benek. So we're here today to talk about tech and theology, and I'm really excited, Chris, to kind of just pick your brain here. So first, tell us what it means to be a techno-theologian.
Yeah, so the great thing about technology is you kind of get to define what you are because people aren't really sure what that means. And when you're talking about emerging spaces, it's really kind of talking about these fundamental questions about who we are. And as Christians, we're made in the image of God. And I just kind of talked about before the break, what does it mean to be made in the image of a creator, redeemer, or a spirit God in a digital realm? And I think so. So as we think about that, it really focuses us to think about how do we understand reality, and part of the way and the thing that's kind of been popularized through some of my work is, I kind of did this from a perspective of artificial intelligence. And so what I did was I thought, well, from God's perspective, what is humanity? And I would contend that we are God's AI. And what I mean by that is we're God's, I don't like the word artificial. I think that's a poor use of it. We use verbiage in emerging technology that doesn't actually define, and it kind of limits. But I like the word alternative because, for example, my cat is a different kind of intelligence than I am. But my cat shows affection. It shows when it needs something, right? So it's an alternative intelligence. And so if you can kind of accept that general hermeneutic, that would mean that all matter, everything we experience in the world is divine technology. right? So things we call biological or natural, they're actually technological from that hermeneutic. And we're called to be caretakers, stewards, and I would go so far as to say co-creators, like a child with a parent of that of creation or technology, divine technology. And I would say our thinking about that means that we're techno-theologians insofar as we think about that, right? And so it's a different hermeneutic, but I think it's one that's applicable to our modern emerging technological age.
I love it. I think that's great. Talk about what it means to be a Christian transhumanist, and you might need just to kind of explain transhumanism for some too.
Yeah, so transhumanism is the idea that we can modify ourselves using technology to become better versions of ourselves. And I'm giving a very general, because depending on what transhumanist you talk to, it's different. What I noticed was when I started learning about transhumanism, there's a lot of secular transhumanists that kind of had a Nietzschean will to power mentality insofar as we're going to upgrade ourselves and be in charge or be the most powerful or whatever. And I said, well, look, I think there's validity to the fact that we use technology to upgrade ourselves. So and what's fascinating to me is in congregations, the people who get this the most tend to be people who are like 75 and older, because they've had artificial hips, they've had new knees, they've had pacemakers put in, people who've had LASIK eye surgery. LASIK eye surgery is a modification to your body. Like, for example, Tiger Woods was legally blind. He had LASIK eye surgery that gave him 20/15 vision in a profession that requires, precise vision, right? And so I don't think people have a basic, they don't have a basic hang up with the idea of making ourselves better. If I could tell you we could eliminate cancer tomorrow, I don't think there'd be a whole bunch of people that would be like, don't eliminate cancer, right? Particularly in the age of COVID vaccines, right? We're trying to protect ourselves and make ourselves better. The idea of Christian transhumanism, from my perspective, is how do we use technology as we evolve more fully into the image of God in which we were created to be, as we're redeemed into that image, and how do we use technology in a way that benefits everybody? So it's a way that we how are we prayerfully considerate that we don't leave people behind in that, and that we're inclusive of people in a way that economic barriers don't always seem to include, and things like that, and all in systems that we've created, right? An economic system, we've created that. We've created those things as a way, and Jesus talks about those things in the Bible and doesn't demonize them. Actually, Jesus has a lot of things to say about how we should invest and to make sure we get a good return, right? But how do we think about how do we leverage those things in ways that brings about the participatory redemptive purposes of Christ in the world? And so that's kind of a general. Now, if you get into it, and you can go to the Christian Transhumanist website, there are lots of conversations, and depending on people's theological positions, they're all over the place on what they believe. And that's great, because it's an emerging space. And in starting those organizations, we didn't say, hey, we have all the answers. We said, here's a way to formalize intentionality in having a conversation. And so that's been very fruitful. There's been a couple Christian transhumanist conferences now. We've had scholars from all over the world that have been involved with the CTA, and we have some really great folks there that are helping to think through that that are cross-denominational and really willing to think about these challenging issues but exciting issues for what it looks like to be the future of humanity.
Yeah, it reminds me several years ago when I was in Bible college, I remember we had to do like a basic assignment for our, I think it was hermeneutics class, and what's a biblical principle about like a heart transfer? And I think, early on there was some, I imagine at least there was some debate, and this kind of gets into ethics, medical ethics, right? About what's the, how ethical is it to transplant body parts? And I imagine like the same conversations are relevant here, again, depending on your understanding of transhumanism, about how far, and I imagine many of the same conversations that were happening, I don't know, 50, 100 years ago, whenever transplants started becoming a thing of like, playing God and messing with the human body. That I imagine it's the same conversations to some extent. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I kind of lead with the hermeneutic idea, because part of it is if we understand we're supposed to be stewards or even co-creators, like a child with their parent, then we start to understand some of the issues around that and how we should talk about those things. And I think there should be. You can have these conversations about big tech and censorship right now, right? I definitely think there need to be conversations about it, because what we tend to do is we take a product, we run to market with it, and we try to make as much money as we can as fast as we can, and then we worry about the ethical conversations later. I think as you talk about medical things, I mean, and the coronavirus is a great example. Like, hey, this is a huge issue, so we're going to cut some corners, and now all of a sudden the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is sitting on the sidelines because they're like, maybe there's bigger issues we didn't think about. So I think there's always a balance, right? And I would commend them for taking a break and saying, hey, okay, this is only 6 people out of, almost 7 million, but still we need to make sure we're not messing people up in the process. On the flip side of that, I also think, like, when we think about our relationship to God, we tend to think a very limited version, and I think that says more about how we think about ourselves than how God thinks about us. So like the example I give is I have a 6-year-old, right? And my 6-year-old loves to color. And but I think if you were to sit down and objectively evaluate his coloring ability versus mine, I think I'm a better colorer than he is, because I've had 39 more years to practice than he has, right? So but how does it change my relationship with him, or my love for him, or my authority in relationship to him, if he becomes a better colorer than me? If he's a better colorer than me, then it doesn't change any of that. And actually, as his parent, I want him to become the best version he can be of himself. So in relationship to God, I think we always we think, well, because we know what we are, we think the worst scenario, but we don't think about, in love and grace, what the possibilities might be and how God is open to that, because by virtue of who God is, we can't threaten that relationship by who we would become unless we separate ourselves from God. So as long as we're doing those things in God, you know what I mean? It's not an issue. So I think that's when we think about what the potential of humanity is, we shouldn't get too freaked out by that. I think part of what we need to think about is, like, if you're doing a valve transplant and you're taking a valve from a pig and you're putting it in a human, which is something that they do, it's like, well, what is our ethic regarding animals? That's a tricky thing. And I think a lot of folks we don't have an animal ethic on a lot of things. If you look at how chickens are handled, it's pretty abhorrent. And I don't know, I mean, no matter whether you're for or against eating various meats, whatever, I think anybody can look at that scenario and go, is this the best caretaking role that we can do? You know what I mean? And I think we have to push ourselves into those spaces if we're really going to live into what Christ calls us to be. And we have to say, well, are there better versions of it? So I always told people I was a hypocrite on this. I'm married to a Texan. And so I loved eating a good steak, right? But I knew I was a hypocrite in that issue, and I stopped about a year and a half ago eating chicken and beef, and I did it for ethical reasons, not because but I also have hope in the technological promise of Impossible Burgers and things like that that are actually pretty good now, and I think that those things. It'll continue to it's the first iteration meat, right? But it'll continue to get better to the point where I think it'll raise a question, do we have to slaughter animals? And I think that's an ethical question that we need to get to at some point, and we need to have a conversation. And I think it leads into other questions when we start thinking about those beings as being alternative intelligence. We need to start thinking about, well, what does that mean when it comes to the rights of things that we might create in the future in the form of artificial intelligence that maybe is sentient, or has what we would define as being sentient. So, the question becomes, is if an AI comes to you and says, I'm a person, I recognize myself as having autonomy, I believe in God, at what point do you believe it or don't? Because I kind of take for granted that you're a real person, right? I just take that at face value, right? I don't really, what proof do I have aside from the fact that you're telling me, and you act that way? What do I have? So, so I think those raise issues that we have to think about, and we have to think about, in comprehensive ways. I don't think we're going to solve all those things overnight. I think they're emerging, but I do think there's a better way to do it than just rushing in. I think we should be prayerful about it. And I also don't want to limit technological growth. And I also think that there are things that might sound controversial, but in the Christian tradition, they really aren't. Like, for example, death is our enemy, right? Death is the enemy of humanity. Christ went to the cross to defeat death, right? And so we know that in Christ we have victory. So what happens if we're able to overcome death through technological some manner?
Well, hold on. I want to ask you that question later.
Yeah, great.
Well, I love the approach you're coming at here. A is like the theological foundation, and then B, the emphasis on inclusivity in tech, because I think, that's one thing that I've learned is technological advances, the what's the word I'm thinking of? The effects are not equally felt by everyone, and they disproportionately tend to affect, others, disproportionately. That's what I'm trying to say. So I really appreciate kind of that approach. Let me get into some they're kind of like specific questions, but I think they'll kind of relate, broadly speaking, to what we're talking about. So you mentioned about AI, and I was listening to an interview recently on Fresh Air, NPR's podcast thing, and it was an interview about AI and like how artificial intelligence is being used to like write stories and replacing some of the things like a journalist might do. And I was thinking about like, there could come a day where AI is preaching a sermon or writing theology. And I'm curious, like, it sounds like if I'm hearing you, you'd probably say that's fine. So am I?
No, I'd actually say it's already happening.
Oh,
because you've written sermons, and so have I.
You really have? Okay, so you really have a broad view of this.
Yeah, so my thing is like, look, I'm God's alternative intelligence. And so do I think there's a possibility if God could create me that God could use humanity to create some other version? Sci-fi talks about this all the time. It's the Battlestar Galactica Cylon, right? It's only indistinguishable because people know that there's a difference. And how it comes into existence comes through a technological way. But I think this is like a fascinating thing. You look at like pro-life, pro-choice, not saying where people are on it, but I think at some point there'll be a day where the pro-life thing will be to actually have your baby outside of your body, because it'll be able to be more technologically controlled. And then eventually that'll probably be integrated back into the body if that's a function of the body that we want to have happen. But it may be where you have people who are pro-life who are saying we shouldn't have the way we've traditionally had babies. We shouldn't have them that way, which is not what you'd hear now, right? So I just think tech changes the parameters of how we talk about things. It evolves the way language evolves, and I think there's value in understanding that. And as we look at AI, I think if we have a broad lens, then it's easier for us to come in and go, well, what's the contextual version? Is it that my Roomba is going to be up in the pulpit anytime soon? No, because that's not the functionality of it, right? But is there a potential in the future? Yes, and I think more likely is what'll happen is that tech will be integrated with people. So at some point, Elon Musk this sounds super sci-fi to people, but it's not all that sci-fi. Elon Musk is working on neural net. And neural net right now is basic reparative function of the brain. But his goal is for people to be able to have matrix style uploads, right? So you would potentially be able to have all of the great sermon references ever in history. You'd be able to, if I could, whether it's glasses or some kind of implants, this sounds super sci-fi, but if you look at tech, you carry your cell phone around now like it is an extension of self. And if there's a better version of that, you take it in a second. And so if you can all of a sudden look into your congregation and you can analyze based on their facial expressions the way you're going to most be impactful in their spiritual life, you're going to do that, because the goal is for them is to connect them to God more fully and to decrease separation from God. And so that would be our goal. So I think we'll just take advantage of that naturally in whatever form that comes into. And that's why I've suggested, I know people are super freaked out by things like facial recognition, but I think churches will use facial recognition. They say that as they're logging into their phone using facial recognition, which Apple and Google and everybody else is using their...
I have mine turned off, by the way.
Yeah, right. So, but it's like, I think from a safety and a security thing, we just have to get to this place where we understand that, the iniquity of our heart is going to be exposed through technology. And part of what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to learn to love each other in grace and work with one another on the things that we all need help with, that frankly lie in the secrets and the shadows now, because we're shamed and embarrassed to deal with them.
Do you think this like privacy, because that's so much of what the pushback is about AI or facial recognition and kind of data, customer data storage, whatever I'm trying to say, is kind of the argument you hear so often is privacy and misuse of data. Do you think it comes down to just like this worry and shame about having our secrets exposed?
Some of it. I mean, don't get me wrong. People can take your privacy and wildly abuse it too. So I think there's a data issue as far as securing and making sure justice is had for people, and that's a responsibility of us. Because you don't want people to be profiled, you don't want people to lose their identity, you don't want them to be stolen from. So the good boundaries happens with data privacy. On the flip side of that, I also think some of it is we hide, and our concern comes out of our shame of what we're afraid would be exposed about. Like, and the reality is, think about this: if you were upgraded with neural net and all of a sudden people knew what you thought on a daily basis, good grief. Like, the things that go through my head, I don't want anyone seeing that stuff. You know what I mean? Like, and because I don't feel like I have, I don't know that always even reflects who I am in the moment, right? They're just the synapses going off, and people have been experienced trauma, or they've experienced other things that shape them in certain ways. And I think this is where we learn to have to have grace with folks, to learn to understand that, we like to act like, and I'm an advocate for personal responsibility, but I also think we have to understand that we're in a larger system that impacts us, and tech is larger systems that will continue to impact us. And so we have to look at, what's the virtue proposition underneath this technology that we're creating? What are the foundations? And that's where it gets scary, because if you start to say, well, what's the virtue proposition that Mark Zuckerberg is basing Facebook off of, that literally uses ad revenue and creates, they use ad revenue in a way where they create posts that cause you to have conflict-oriented conversations so that you'll stay on their platform longer so they can make more money in ad revenue. Well, I don't know that that's a great virtue proposition. And I think those are things that need groups of people to say, well, how do we allow you to make money, which we shouldn't be opposed to because they're providing a service, while also caring for people in the way that allows them to most fully live into being a human being?
Well, so much is going through my head right now, but let me ask, well, first I'd say I'm thinking about, we don't have to dive into this, but I'm reminding, one of my favorite movies, I, Robot. A lot of what you're talking about, that the AI having sentience, because that's a big theme of that movie. Also, that's like a classic. That one line is, "Somehow I told you so." It just doesn't quite cut it.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you talked about the neural network, and this is something I was going to ask you about. Is I haven't watched, but I've heard there's shows that kind of touch on this theme of like uploading your consciousness to the cloud. And certainly in traditional Christianity, we have these very traditional understandings of heaven and hell. Like, do we need to redefine, our understanding of the afterlife, do you think, in light of what possibilities might arise about, first, like, A, like cryogenics, and B, like, uploading your consciousness to the cloud?
Well, look, I think anybody who thinks that in any time soon they're going to upload their consciousness to the cloud, they need to go have some serious conversation with neuroscientists, because that's just not a feasible thing. That is literally of sci-fi. And look, there are folks like Ray Kurzweil, who I have a lot of respect for the work that Ray has done on several things, but there are things that, in my perspective, come out of a desire that comes out of mourning and loss, like in Ray's case for his dad. Which I totally empathize with. There are many people I've lost that I would love to be with and around now, but I don't think that technologically I can recreate them or whatever. It currently, right? And I don't think we're anywhere close to. We don't know enough about the brain, and that's why I said even neural net. You got the richest man in the world working on, he's working on reparative functions, and the things they're highlighting with like monkeys being able to play video games with their brain. We were able to do that stuff in the 60s. So this is not like humans who were able to do that stuff. It's just, the meme is coming back around, right? But do we need to redefine how we think about the afterlife? Well, look, predominant mainline Christianity has kind of had a escapism mentality for a long time on theology, right? It's like, we're waiting for Jesus to come back so he can fix everything. And, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. And so, cut down the rain for us. And it doesn't matter if we strip mine or whatever, because we're not staying here anyhow.
Right. Ronald Reagan's Interior Secretary.
And I think we just need to say that is not the biblical message. And I think a participatory understanding is that we are called to be the caretakers and the stewards of. We're not leaving. N.T. Wright talks about we're interlocking heaven and earth. Now, what does that mean? If heaven is like in the cartoons, they say, I'm going to sit on a cloud and play a harp for eternity, that sounds like the worst nightmare ever. That is terrible, and so I like to say, what can we learn about an eschatological future by looking at the resurrection of Christ? And I think what's helpful in that is we see Jesus, who is physical still, so he's incarnational. He asks Thomas to touch him, right? This is a question. He says, I'm not a ghost, look at me. He's still hungry. He still does certain things that, but he's also not quite like us either. Disciples who've been with him for up to 3 years don't recognize him when they're face to face until ritual action happens. So he's shapeshifter Jesus. I don't know what you make of that, right? Like there's like he comes through locked doors and just pops into rooms. One of the craziest things in the Bible, in my opinion, is Jesus has died, he's resurrected, and he pops into a room full of people and essentially is looking for food. If Jesus shows up in my kitchen one night looking for Oreos, I'm going to be freaked out. Like that, so you can understand why they're freaked out. So there's this Jesus, he's kind of like us, but he's still different in some ways. He's like Jesus 2.0. And I think what that is that's an emerging tech thing. I think if we look at from a hermeneutic of technology, I would say the eschaton is technological. We just don't have a good sense of what the extent of possibility is with that technology. We're constantly learning about it. We're learning about what it means at the quantum level and whether there's levels, interdimensionally. And scientists would affirm all of that. I don't think anybody who's on kind of, in cosmology or they're, in quantum level, they're not going to deny that there are things that are I mean, they call them spooky because they don't know how they act. So I think as we think about those things, we need to stop thinking about, I like to challenge congregations to say, what do you envision to be heaven like? And when we talk about those things, how much of that is our projection versus what we actually see happening and what we read in the scriptures that heaven will be like? And how do we see, when you talk about justice happening, what does that mean technologically? And if we start to look at everything as technology, well, then what does it mean? And so that means if we're present in the moment and we're kind of looking at our own spiritual disciplines and things, we start to say, okay, so how is it that my Netflix watching aids to the purpose of justice? How do we start to, we start to self-evaluate and actually say, well, what am I made for, and how can I most fully live into being who I am? And this starts to, over time, shape us and form us in ways where we can start to see, because it's not about where we're going. It's about where we are and what we will become and what Christ will form us into. And then the other thing is, and this comes back to that death question, is it's like, early Christians thought that Jesus was going to return and they weren't going to die. They thought that, and so in a guy like Ray Kurzweil talks about the singularity happening. And, this is essentially the idea that we create something smarter than us, and then it creates something smarter than it. And then that happens eventually so fast that instead of just kind of going on a slope, it just rockets into, and they borrow this phrase from physics, singularity, to say, we don't know what that'll mean. It'll happen in an exponential period. Well, how do we know that there's not some kind of singularity event that brings about the eschaton? And that there might be, and maybe not you and I, or maybe not our children, but maybe our children's children or our children's children's children, maybe they don't have to die to bring about Christ's redemptive purposes on earth. And maybe that can be part of the possibility of what Christ has in the redemption of creation. And I think those are exciting things for us to think of, because think about how quickly we developed a COVID vaccination. What if the world's resources, we took that and we applied it to death, and we said, okay, so here are the top things that kill people. We want to take heart disease and cancer off the list, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to put exponential amount of money into this until we take out that issue. Think about what that would do for humanity in general, and all of the scientific breakthroughs that would probably come through as we push towards those kind of things. And I think those are the things that we need to be looking at as we think about what it means to be human, because I think, again, we don't have to feel like we're in competition with God and, oh no, I became too good of a colorer. You know what I mean? God's not threatened by that. I don't think God's threatened by that at all. The question is are we being prayerful and mindful? Are we living into the commandments that God has put before us as we do that? Or are we doing it just out of our, own desire to be little g gods? And if we're doing it in that, then that's idolatry, and God tells us not to do that. But if we're doing it living into the fullness of who we're created to be in the image of God, then it's a different thing. And certainly, I think what humans will look like, 1,000 years from now may seem godlike to what we experience as human beings now. You know what I mean? But if they're within the framework of Christ, it'll be different. And wouldn't you expect your eschatological version of yourself to be more godly than your current version? Isn't kind of that the purpose, right? So it's like that. I don't think that's a big theological leap, frankly. I just think it's a pivot to understand how we fit with technology in this space.
I'm thinking too about another sci-fi movie. I haven't watched the whole series set, but I've always been fascinated by the story of Terminator. So when you talk about the singularity, I don't know if they use that word in that. Do they use the word singularity? But Skynet...
I don't know if it was just popularized with Skynet.
Yeah, so obviously the premise of that series is that Skynet becomes whatever sentient or whatever word, and basically just oppresses and kills humanity. What kind of assurances do we have?
Well, look, I mean, the reality is you have the assurance that Christ died on the cross and that the victory has already been achieved, right? So it doesn't say there will be no suffering in between. And actually, if you read Revelation, depending on how your interpretation is, some pretty bad stuff could happen in between there, right? But the thing is, and what I would say to you is, look, tech. I'm not an early tech. I speak about emerging tech everywhere, and advise people and do all sorts of stuff with it. But the first thing I tell them is I'm not an early adopter on a lot of things. And here's why. Because it's got bugs. So when the new iPhone comes out, I'm not one of these people that's going to be standing in line for the new iPhone. I'm going to let the 15-year-olds that want to go and burn $800 go burn it and play with it for 3 months, because they have the time to get through all the things that are wrong with it. And Apple will do the upgrades. So by the time I buy it in 9 months, or whenever my current phone dies, right? Because I'm trying to be a good steward of my resources, and I don't need the newest, hottest thing. It needs to meet my current need, right? By the time I get it, I get a better product. I think when tech comes out, VR is a good example of this. VR, we're on the very front end of tech, the tech of VR. It's clunky. It's awkward. A lot of people don't like it. And it's only now that people, because things like the Oculus Quest 2 are at a cheaper price point, which I think Facebook's probably losing money because they're trying to popularize VR, and your wireless now. I think that's why it's popularizing, because it's becoming user friendly. And so, as we look at some of those things, I think part of what it does is it pivots our understanding of technology and how things will come about, and I think we don't need to be anxious about that. I think we need to keep pushing, but be prayerful in that pushing. We don't need to be fearful, but we need to continue to develop those things as we go. But we also need to recognize that there may be things where tech is used for bad. And this is why with facial recognition, people talk about it. We shouldn't talk about it from a perspective of fear, though. We should talk about it from a perspective of how do we serve the most people and be the most helpful. And the difference, I think, in that is the world would love to get us to engage in conflict methodology. And I don't need to. And the reason they do that is exactly how Facebook's making money off of you. It's for that reason. That's why the nightly news phrases everything. When I was a kid, not everything was a drama. It wasn't all a problem. The news was a different thing. But now it is. And now this is why you got clickbait articles and ads and all sorts of stuff, because, and I have no problem. I live and work in the finance district in Miami. I have no problem with people making money. I think that's a good thing. I think the Bible calls us to a justice-centered principle around being good stewards of finances. That being said, I also think that we've created a conflict methodology with people that's unnecessary and unhelpful. And I think the church has a lot to say about how we get through that, as opposed to leading into conflict methodology with people, which frankly, many churches, particularly fundamentalist churches, tend to lean on that model to remain relevant in their mind, because they think that but we have to be wise enough as humans to say, what, I'm not going to get caught up into that issue, because if it's a hot button issue, the thing that I really need is I need to see the person on the other side of the issue and what the pain point is for them and how this is impacting them, and then I need to figure out how together in community do we actually address the issue that's in question. So I think that's, do we have to worry about those scenarios? I think Elon Musk was worried about it. I know he was, because he literally, go look up Elon Musk. A couple of years back, he was going around. He went to the governors' conference in the United States and tried to tell governors that we need to have AI regulation. I know this because I was involved with some with another country. I helped them to come up with some of their AI regulations and safeguards. And Elon Musk was running around saying, we need to do something. And they didn't listen. And SpaceX came out of this because Elon said, we we're going to destroy this world and AI is going to take over, so we need to have another habitable place we can go to. Now, the folly in his argument is that if they're smart enough to kill us here, they're smart enough to follow us there and kill us too. That's the thing. The difference is I have a far more optimistic view of this because I have hope in Christ. I know how the story ends, largely speaking. And so I'm not going to fear the end result because I believe, and my faith tells me that Christ will ultimately have the victory. So, if there's a Terminator, my goal is going to be to convert it. That's going to be my job.
Wow, this is the best eschatological conversation I've had in some time right here. Mixing in the Terminator, Elon Musk, in Revelation. Let me ask one more question because I don't want to keep you all day here. You mentioned VR, and we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. VR church, the idea of that. I'm a big believer in the gathered community. Now, I kind of know what you're going to say based on our conversations already, but the skeptic or cynic in me might be like, hey, there's still something to human beings gathered in physical proximity to one another. So when we talk about VR church, even virtual church, online church, we've been experiencing it for this past year, or the pandemic as we're recording this now. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so couple things. I think part of it is we need to start thinking about distinctions in verbiage. Using the word virtual for a Zoom call is not completely inaccurate, but it's not fully what we're doing at this point. So I think we need to make a distinction between digital and virtual. And one of the differences, I would say, in a truly virtual immersive, where you have a headset on at this point and you're in an immersive 3D world, is that you are embodied virtually. So there is a level of embodiment. It's a big deal because in many denominations, they've officiated communion in the digital space. And there was a big conversation about, can we do this? I think it's a lot easier to have the communion because of the understanding of the Holy Spirit's involvement. I think it's a lot easier to have that conversation about the digital space than it is to talk about baptism, for example. That's a different, because I don't think the church has done the work of talking about what do we think about matter at the quantum level, which I think we have to have that conversation at some point, because it gets into questions of superposition. We have superpositionmagazine.com, and the name superposition comes out of this idea that if you look at matter at a quantum level, particulate matter has two states that it holds at once. It holds the state of a wave and a particle at the same time. And scientists don't understand why this is, but the thing that blows everyone's mind is when it is observed, it takes the state of one or the other. Okay, so it's holding two states at once, but when it's observed, it takes one state or the other. So this is a great way we understand Trinitarian theology, 3 in 1, and we observe. And I look at Jesus performing miracles, for example. So if Jesus can see the quantum level of something, we see sickness, he sees health, and they're healed because he observes healing into existence. We see liquid, he sees solid, and he walks on water because he observes it into existence. We see a storm, he sees peace, he observes it into existence. So I think there's almost a Neo-level Matrix conversation to be had at that level. So we've not talked about that. But in VR, when you talk about communion, it's very different because it's virtual. So it's embodied. So you have an embodied presence. So the way I've been doing VR is I actually stream. So you see my avatar in the virtual space. You see my present existence in the digital space. So you see three versions of me effectively. You know that this version exists on this side of the screen. You see the digital representation of me, and then you see the virtual. And we've done digital communion with my church as allowed by our denomination. I've not done sacraments in virtual because I think we need to have deeper conversations, and kind of like transhumanism, my job's not to rock the boat. It's to invite people into the conversation to say, when are we comfortable, or are we comfortable doing these? What I would say is VR is a long way from being done, and I think there will become a time when it will be nearly indistinguishable whether you are in VR or whether you are in your current existence. There'll just be some biological functions that even long-term may be things that may not have to address. I mean, we don't typically talk about, will we go to the bathroom in heaven? I mean, these are like kind of crazy issues, right? But it's things to think about. And what does that mean? I'm sure there's some PhD dissertation on that somewhere, right? So, but I think it's like, as we start to think about virtual communities, I think what we need to think about is the reality is that there are so many people who are disconnected from having the ability to attend a physical church. And sometimes it's their circumstances. So when I went in and started Church Plus, it's CHVRCHPLUS. So it's like Humanity Plus, but churchplus.com. When we started doing that, what we've had was within a month and a half, we had representation from many, many countries and representation from 6 different continents. And what we found was there were people in China who were sneaking outside the government protocols of what they were allowed to do on the internet to be in VR chat where we were, for us to be able to engage in ministry with them. There are people who they were the primary caregivers for people who had, health issues. And so so they were stuck at home all the time. They didn't do it. There are people who have disabilities that they don't have the ability to get out. There were people in rural areas that don't have the ability to do it. And so the thing is there are 2.2 billion people in the world now that say that they are actively gamers in some capacity, and millions of VR headsets are being sold. For the world to not look into this space, for the church to not look into this space that is exponentially increasing, is kind of us sticking our head in the sand, frankly. And I think so part of what we've tried to do is we have a group of pastors now that we are getting together to help them to just show what we know. And then we're also working on some platform related issues to create virtual spaces for churches to be where they have the quality control elements that they might not get from big tech, because big tech isn't worried about their interests. And so we're doing this as a missional way. So if there's people listening to this that say, hey, I'd love to start a virtual church, what's that? And part of that is I think COVID has shown us that the way we do church is oftentimes overpriced. We put a lot of money on physical spaces. We spend money in ways that we don't necessarily need, but we get stuck into old programs and structures. And COVID, in some ways, has been freeing because it's allowed us the excuse to get out of those systems and to say, what do we actually need and what's the best stewardship of our resources? And so the virtual church provides low overhead. And the thing is you can't judge a book by its cover, because you might have a 40-year-old man dressed as an anime girl, in VR, and you're like, well, what's that about? You know what I mean? And so you have to actually have a conversation and build a relationship. And there's a lot of things in the institutional church where we do all the right things on paper, but we actually don't build relationships. You can have a kick-butt worship service, and a lot of people can come through your church and never build a relationship with them. They can give, you can build the empire of the church, but you actually don't ever make a disciple through that process. That exists. We've seen it exist. And so this forces us actually to get behind what's behind the avatar. What are the actual needs of the person, and it forces pastors, frankly, to be vulnerable, because most pastors are in a space they're not as comfortable in as they're in when they're up on the pedestal, frankly, in their local congregation. You're a lot closer to what Paul was experiencing when he's walking into a city that might not welcome him at first. And trying to build relationships amidst that chaos that's developing. But I think those are exactly the spaces we need to be in. And I think there's a huge missional opportunity for the church here. I would actually say in my denomination, we have 120 some presbyteries, and my hope is in the next 5 years, every single one of those presbytery has a new church development that happens in VR. And I can go so far as to say that from a 3 to 5 year standpoint, I could show them how to make that self-sustainable too, as far as their overhead. Because ministry doesn't happen overnight. Anybody who thinks that you're going to build ministry in a month, I think is kidding themselves. But it takes a good 3 to 5 years to see how it's going to work out and pan out. But way easier to do it from a technological standpoint. And the tools, the good news is the tools are only going to get better. Oculus, we had a second iteration of Oculus within a year and a half. I mean, that is phenomenal rate of speed that it's being improved upon. So I think that's exciting space for us that we need to be in, and I enjoy it just because it's so fascinating to see how creative people can be when they have mediums to explore their creativity more fully. And that's the thing about VR is it's not always easy right now for people, but as it's getting easier, the creativity is just unbelievable. And you even see this like with kids who play like Minecraft and whatever. You give a kid the ability to build something, and and it used to be from my generations it was Legos or whatever, you know what I mean? But you allow mediums for people to be creative, and the things that they can create are unbelievable. And I think what that speaks to is it speaks to the God who created us, who created beings who can create things that are unbelievable, and expand our imaginations. And so I'm really excited to see what the future of humanity is going to look like, how we're going to experience it, and what a wonderful privilege we get to be in an age where we actually see this stuff unfolding before us. It makes me excited to wake up every day and say, well, what are you doing now, God?
Wow. This has been an incredible conversation, and there's so many more questions I want to ask you, but we're already way over. So let's take a break real quick, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverend Dr. Chris Benek, and man, Chris, I'm biting my tongue. I'm sure you have better things to do today too, but thanks so much. It's been a really fun conversation. So take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to, but if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do? What's that day look like?
Well, I'm in the Reformed tradition, so but I'm married to a Catholic, so I don't know that I would be able to easily outlaw being Pope, and I don't think my wife would allow me to be Pope. So I don't know if this question works for me. I would probably eliminate the papacy, being a Reformed person, but I'd have to live with the marital strife that would take care of. So I'm gonna politely no comment on the Pope for a day.
Fair enough. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
I would love to bring back Max Stackhouse. He was my mentor. Max was a wonderful human being, and pretty much anyone that ever was a mentee for him, they speak highly of him. He was somebody who he knew how to provide me grace when I needed it the most. And there were and I don't even know if he knew he was doing it. It was who he was. And I was just always admired the fact that at Princeton, there would always be some student from a developing country that was living in his house because they couldn't afford housing. And nobody knew it except for Max and that student, and I would go over and see them there, and they would be like, "Oh, I live here," and it's like these quiet things that he and his wife Jean did, and I miss him, and so and so I don't know that I want Calvin back right now or whatever. I think he'd really struggle with the way theology has emerged. Some of these reformers, they would be in hot water in our traditions right now. So.
What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think the church is on the precipice of this fantastic renewal right now, and I think I just think there's this technological reformation that's happening as we're kind of opening up to a new hermeneutic and understanding of who we are. And I'm just really excited to see how that's going to happen. God doesn't typically give us things the way we anticipate or even want them. And if we can learn to kind of live in the fluidity of that and the creativity of that, I think it becomes a marvelous thing for us to see how God is weaving things together through us. And so I think people will see this as a time where that's happening. And there have been other pandemics, but this one, because of the technological advancement, I think there's an opportunity here, and I think people will remember this as a time where the church really pivoted in some critical ways that it needed to. That shows how God takes our bad situations and turns them into redeeming ones.
It's interesting. I'm hearing that a lot from folks about, like a third spiritual revolution or awakening, I guess is the word, or those similar type things, and just the theme being like it's not going to look like what we're expecting it to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a sense that something's bubbling, and we're going to see it more and more of it. So,
you've kind of alluded to this, but talk if you want to give something else specific about what you hope for the future of Christianity.
Honestly, I mean, my prayer is that Thy will be done, and that's anytime I have a vision of something, it's usually rooted in something that's, if it's just me independently, it's just not going to be there. And what I've learned is that if what I hope for is not hoped for in the plans of God, then ultimately, even though I might think I want it short term, it's not what's good for me long term. And so, and I think that's the case with humanity. We struggle with that, but I think part of that is we project all of our baggage onto God, and we don't understand the grace and the love and compassion that God has for us as God's children. And so, once we start to understand that, I think that we'll be able to live more fully into who we are, and so I just hope that God's will continues to be done, and hopefully we'll be prayerful enough and in community enough to help to discern those things together as we build our the technological future that's coming.
Yeah. Tell folks where they can find out more about you and your work.
So we've got a couple websites being redesigned, but you can still go there and still read stuff. So ChristopherBenek.com is my personal page. Co-creators with a S Tech, co-creatorstech.com is where you can read more about co-creators. Church Plus is CHVRCHPLUS.com. And we write about, and Lauren, you'd be a great person to write for Superposition, or even to have your podcast posted on.
Well, we're going to talk more about that offline.
Yeah, it'd be great. But superpositionmagazine.com is a place where we kind of use that hermeneutic of tech to raise questions with people and to think about who we are, made in the image of God in this technologically emerging world. So those are a bunch of places, but I'm all over the place. Social media, you can find me, Twitter, Facebook.
We didn't mention this. We talked about this pre-recording. Daily Show. Find him. Interview on the Daily Show. Is that still live somewhere?
Right. Yeah, somewhere. It's out there. Yeah, there's a bunch of press, and there's probably still a bunch of those links on my personal page if people go and look. So.
Well, Chris, this has been so much fun. So thanks so much for your time. And may God's peace be with you.
Thank you for having me. Blessings.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Torn Curtain Arts in partnership with Resonate Media. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit futurechristian.com. If you've enjoyed the show and you think it would be valuable for others to hear, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. That really helps more people find us. Thanks again, and go in peace.